Let me tell you something fascinating about generations. They don't just grow up in different years. They grow up in different emotional climates. Two people can be 20 years apart in age, yet feel like they were raised on different planets. Gen X learned to survive in silence. Gen Z learned to survive in visibility. And somewhere between those two survival strategies lies a psychological shift that explains almost everything about how we think, work, love, and cope today. Think about this. One generation grew up without the internet. The other has never known a world without it. One waited for phone calls. The other waits for notifications. One learned independence through absence. The other learned identity through exposure. And here's the real question. What does that do to the human mind? Let's start with Gen X. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, Generation X came of age during economic uncertainty, rising divorce rates, and a culture that valued self-reliance over self-expression. Many of them were what psychologists called latchkey kids. They came home to empty houses. They figured things out alone. And when you grow up learning that no one is constantly watching, you develop something powerful. Internal resilience. Psychologists often associate Gen X with a stronger internal locus of control, the belief that outcomes depend largely on your own actions, not external forces. They weren't raised on constant feedback. There were no likes, no algorithmic applause. Validation came slowly, or not at all. So they learned not to expect it. Now contrast that with Gen Z. Born roughly between 1997 and 2012, Gen Z grew up in a world where identity is shaped in public. Their teenage years unfolded on platforms. Their friendships were mediated by screens. Their mistakes sometimes became permanent. And psychologically, that changes everything. Gen Z developed under what researchers call continuous partial attention, a state where the brain is constantly scanning, scrolling, reacting. It's not a distraction. It's an adaptation. Their brains became wired for speed, visibility, and rapid feedback. Here where it gets interesting. Gen X learned to process emotions privately. Gen Z learned to process emotions collectively. When Gen X struggled, they often internalized it. Therapy wasn't openly discussed. Vulnerability wasn't currency. Strength meant composure. But Gen Z grew up in an era where mental health conversations became normalized. Anxiety, depression, trauma, these weren't whispered. They were posted, discussed, validated. And that creates two very different psychological instincts. Gen X asks, how do I handle this on my own? Gen Z asks, who else feels this too? Neither is wrong. They're simply different survival codes. Consider work. For Gen X, work often equals stability, security, a paycheck that proves competence. They watch their parents struggle economically. They experience recessions. They learned that loyalty and endurance were protective. So psychologically, many Gen X individuals equate identity with reliability. But Gen Z views work through a different lens. They ask, does this align with my values? Does this protect my mental health? Is this meaningful? Where Gen X learned endurance, Gen Z learned boundary setting. And to one generation, that can look like toughness. To the other, it can look like fragility. But beneath that judgment lies a deeper psychological truth. Gen X fears instability. Gen Z fears burnout. Social interaction reveals another divide. Gen X grew up navigating face-to-face conflict. Awkward silences, uncomfortable conversations, misunderstandings that had to be resolved in person. As a result, many developed strong tolerance for discomfort. Gen Z, on the other hand, grew up with the option to curate interactions. You can mute, block, and follow. This creates heightened awareness of emotional boundaries, but sometimes reduced tolerance for friction. It's not that Gen Z is less resilient. It's that their resilience formed in a different arena. Gen X learned to survive neglect. Gen Z learned to survive overstimulation. And overstimulation leaves marks. Studies in cognitive psychology show that constant digital engagement reshapes attention spans and reward processing. Gen Z's dopamine cycles are faster. Feedback loops are immediate. This doesn't mean they are addicted or weak. It means their brains adapted to an environment of perpetual connectivity. Meanwhile, Gen X developed patience through delay. They waited for the film to develop. They waited for answers. They waited for an opportunity. Patience became muscle memory. Now let's talk about authority. Gen X tends to distrust institutions quietly. They grew up watching scandals unfold on television. They saw corporations collapse. They learned skepticism early. But their rebellion was subtle, detached, often ironic. Gen Z's distrust is louder. They question publicly, organize digitally, challenge systems visibly. Their rebellion is expressive. Psychologically, this reflects a shift from private cynicism to public activism. Gen X says, "I don't trust the system." Gen Z says, "Let's change it." Emotionally, there's another layer. Gen X often developed emotional self-sufficiency because they had to. Independence wasn't a choice. It was a requirement. But self-sufficiency can sometimes mask isolation. Gen Z, in contrast, developed emotional fluency. They have language for their inner states. They name their triggers. They identify patterns. But hyper-awareness can sometimes amplify anxiety. So one generation struggles silently. The other struggles visibly. One hides pain to appear strong. The other shares pain to feel understood. Here's the paradox. Gen X sometimes envies Gen Z's openness. Gen Z sometimes envies Gen X's steadiness. Because deep down, both generations are navigating uncertainty. They just learned different coping mechanisms. Gen X copes by minimizing. Gen Z copes by externalizing. Gen X says, "It is what it is." Gen Z says, "It doesn't have to be." Even identity formation has shifted. Developmental psychologists describe adolescence as a period of identity exploration. For Gen X, that exploration happened mostly offline. Mistakes faded with time. For Gen Z, identity exploration happens under observation. Every phase can be documented. Every opinion is archived. This creates both empowerment and pressure. When your growth is visible, your self-awareness sharpens. But so does your fear of missteps. So who is more resilient? It depends on how you define resilience. If resilience means enduring hardship quietly, Gen X mastered it. If resilience means navigating complexity while emotionally exposed, Gen Z is redefining it. Both carry strengths shaped by their environment, and both carry wounds shaped by the same. Gen X carries the weight of emotional suppression. Gen Z carries the weight of emotional saturation. But here's what often gets overlooked. They need each other. Gen X offers perspective, the reminder that not everything requires immediate reaction. Gen Z offers awareness, the reminder that not everything should be silently endured. One brings steadiness. The other brings sensitivity. And in psychology, integration is always healthier than polarization. It's easy to turn generational differences into competition. To label one as too soft. The other was too rigid. But generations aren't opposing forces. They're chapters in the same story of adaptation. Each generation reflects the pressures of its time. Gen X was shaped by scarcity of attention. Gen Z was shaped by excess of it. Gen X learned independence through absence. Gen Z learned interdependence through exposure. And maybe the most important realization is this. Neither psychology is accidental. Human beings adapt to survive their environment. Change the environment, and you change your mind. Gen X minds were forged in analog uncertainty. Gen Z minds are forged in digital intensity. Different tools, different threats, different strengths. But underneath the labels, something universal remains. Both generations want security. Both want belonging. Both want meaning. They just define those words differently. For Gen X, security might mean stability. For Gen Z, it might mean emotional safety. For Gen X, belonging might mean loyalty. For Gen Z, it might mean authenticity. And perhaps that's the quiet truth behind generational psychology. It's not about who is stronger. It's about what each generation had to survive. Gen X survived invisibility. Gen Z survived hypervisibility. One learned to endure silence. The other learned to endure noise. And in a world that keeps changing faster than any generation expects, both forms of resilience matter. So the next time you notice the differences, the work habits, the communication styles, the emotional language, pause before judging. Ask instead, what kind of world shaped this mind? Because psychology is never created in isolation. It's carved by culture, technology, economy, and time. Gen X reminds us that strength can be quiet. Gen Z reminds us that strength can be expressive. Gen X shows us how to stand alone. Gen Z shows us how to stand together. And maybe the future doesn't belong to one or the other. Maybe it belongs to the space where steadiness meets sensitivity, where resilience meets awareness, where experience meets evolution. Because in the end, generations are not rivals. They are reflections of shifting worlds, of changing threats, of new ways the human brain learns to cope. And if we listen closely instead of arguing loudly, we might realize something simple. Every generation thinks differently, but every generation is just trying to feel safe in the world it inherited. And that desire, to feel secure, understood, and valued, has never belonged to one age group alone. It belongs to all of us.